Liam had always been a boy who kept to himself. Living on the outskirts of town, in a small, rundown shack with his mother, his life was far from easy. His clothes were often worn and tattered, his shoes had holes in them, and his family barely scraped by. He spent his days running errands for neighbors and doing odd jobs to help his mother make ends meet. Despite their poverty, Liam never complained. He was a quiet, kind boy with a gentle heart, always ready to help those who needed it, even if he had very little himself. On the day that would change his life forever, Liam had just finished delivering groceries for Mrs. Johnston, an elderly woman who lived a few streets down from the center of town. He was on his way back home when he passed by Morrow's jewelry store, one of the fanciest shops in the area. The store was known for selling expensive and exquisite jewelry, far out of the reach of anyone in Liam's world. He rarely even glanced at the sparkling items in the window, knowing they belonged to a world so distant from his own. But that day, something felt off. As Liam walked by the store, he noticed the shopkeeper, Mr. Morrow, standing outside, speaking heatedly to a couple of police officers. His face was red with anger, and his arms flailed as he gestured toward the store. Curious, but not wanting to be seen loitering, Liam slowed his pace, staying on the other side of the street. Before he could react, Mr. Morrow's eyes landed on him. There was a brief moment of silence, and then, like a lightning bolt, the accusation struck. "That's him," Mr. Morrow bellowed, his finger pointing directly at Liam. "That's the boy who stole my necklace." Liam froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He looked behind him, expecting to see someone else there, but there was no one. Confusion washed over him, and before he could say a word, the police officers rushed across the street surrounding him. Their faces were stern, and their eyes were full of suspicion. "I didn't take anything," Liam protested, his voice trembling. "I was just walking home." But Mr. Morrow was having none of it. The shopkeeper marched over, his face twisted in fury. "You were here earlier. Don't think I didn't see you loitering around my shop. And now a $1,000 necklace is missing. You're the only one who could have taken it." Liam shook his head desperately. "I wasn't in the store. I didn't even go near it." But the police officers exchanged looks, already convinced by the shopkeeper's certainty. In a town where appearances mattered, Liam's ragged clothes and dirt-smudged face told a story the officers were all too willing to believe. To them, he looked every bit the part of a desperate, thieving street kid. "Turn out your pockets," one of the officers ordered. Hands shaking, Liam obeyed. He pulled out the few coins he had earned from his errands, along with a small wooden toy he had found discarded in the trash earlier that day. There was no necklace, nothing of value. But Mr. Morrow wasn't satisfied. He must have hidden it somewhere, probably tossed it as soon as he saw me talking to the police. The police officer grabbed Liam's arm, and before he knew it, the cold, hard metal of handcuffs was clamped around his wrists. A crowd had begun to gather, watching the scene unfold. Some whispered among themselves, others pointed and stared. "I didn't do anything," Liam whispered, tears pricking his eyes as the officers led him toward the police car. But the crowd wasn't listening. As he was pushed into the back seat of the car, he could hear their voices, judging, assuming, condemning. "That's the boy who stole from Morrow's? He looks like he would. I always thought there was something suspicious about him. Always hanging around town like that. A thief, no doubt. Just like his father, I bet." The words cut deep. Liam's father had died when he was just a baby, leaving his mother to raise him alone. The idea that people thought he would follow in the footsteps of a man he never knew, based on nothing but assumptions, made his stomach churn. He wasn't a thief. He would never steal. But none of that mattered. The judgment had already been passed. As the police car pulled away from the jewelry store, Liam stared out of the window, his heart sinking. How had this happened? He had done nothing wrong, and yet the weight of an accusation that could destroy his life now hung over him. He could already feel the town turning against him, their whispers growing louder with each passing moment. When they reached the station, Liam was led inside and placed in a small, cold cell. The officers didn't say much to him. To them, this was just another routine arrest, another petty thief caught in the act. Liam sat on the hard bench, his hands still cuffed, staring at the floor. His mind raced, searching for answers, but none came. All he knew was that his world was about to change in ways he couldn't control. Word of the theft and Liam's arrest spread quickly through the small town. By the end of the day, everyone knew the story, and they all had their own version of what had happened. Some said they saw Liam acting suspiciously around the store earlier in the week. Others claimed to have always known he'd end up like this. Even those who had once been kind to him now looked at him with doubt in their eyes. Liam's mother came to the station as soon as she heard. Her face was pale, her eyes filled with worry as she pleaded with the officers to believe in her son's innocence. But there was little she could do. The trial was set for the following week, and until then, Liam's fate hung in the balance. That night, as Liam lay on the cold floor of his cell, his mind kept replaying the moment Mr. Morrow had pointed at him, accusing him of a crime he hadn't committed. His heart ached with the unfairness of it all, but deep down, he knew he couldn't give up. He had to find a way to prove his innocence. Somehow. But how could a poor boy with no money, no connections, and no power stand up against the town's most respected jeweler? Liam sat nervously in the courtroom, his hands trembling in his lap as he looked around at the unfamiliar and intimidating surroundings. The grandeur of the place, with its polished wooden benches, towering judge's seat, and the quiet murmur of spectators, made him feel small, insignificant. He had never been in a place like this before. To him, the courthouse was a world reserved for important people, not someone like him, a poor boy who struggled just to get by. And now he was here, not as a spectator, but as the accused. The weight of the accusation pressed heavily on his shoulders. His heart raced, and no matter how hard he tried to calm himself, the gnawing fear in his gut wouldn't go away. He glanced around at the faces in the room. The jury sat in their designated seats, looking stern and disinterested. Some of them wouldn't even make eye contact with him, while others stared at him as if they had already decided his guilt. Liam's mother sat in the back of the courtroom, her hands clenched together, her eyes red from crying. She had tried to reassure him, but even she seemed to be losing hope. After all, they were up against the town's most respected jeweler. Mr. Morrow had connections, money, and influence, things Liam and his mother didn't have. The prosecuting attorney, a sharp-dressed man with a cold, calculating gaze, stood confidently at the front of the room. He was a seasoned lawyer, known for his ruthless pursuit of justice, and today, Liam was his target. The trial began with the prosecution laying out their case. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," the prosecutor began, his voice smooth and authoritative. "We are here today to bring justice for Mr. Morrow, a man who has served this community for decades, a man whose trust has been violated by a young boy, Liam, who stole a $1,000 necklace from his shop. Now, let us be clear. Liam is a boy from difficult circumstances. He is poor, yes, and he has struggled. But that does not excuse theft." The prosecutor's words hung in the air, and Liam felt the sting of their accusation. He wanted to shout, to tell them that it wasn't true, but he knew better. In this courtroom, his voice didn't carry the same weight as that of the well-dressed lawyer standing before him. The prosecutor continued, pacing back and forth in front of the jury. "Liam had every reason to steal. He is poor, hungry, and desperate. His family struggles to make ends meet. But rather than seek honest work, rather than find another way, he chose to steal from Mr. Morrow's shop." He gestured toward Mr. Morrow, who sat at the witness stand, his expression one of stern determination. Mr. Morrow saw Liam near his shop, loitering suspiciously, and later, when the necklace was found to be missing, Liam was nowhere to be found. Coincidence? I think not. Witnesses will testify to seeing Liam in the area that day, and we will present evidence that clearly shows his intent to steal. Liam's stomach churned as the prosecution presented its case, each word another dagger of doubt thrust into the hearts of the jury. The prosecutor painted a picture of him that was far from reality, a boy driven by desperation to commit a crime. But Liam wasn't a thief. He hadn't taken anything from that shop. Witnesses were called to the stand, one after another, each offering small pieces of circumstantial evidence that seemed to weave a web around Liam. A local woman testified that she had seen Liam hanging around the jewelry store that day, though she admitted she hadn't seen him go inside. Another man claimed to have noticed Liam looking through the window earlier in the week. Though none of the witnesses had seen the actual theft, Their statements only served to bolster the prosecution's narrative that Liam had the opportunity and the motive to steal. Liam's defense attorney, a tired and overworked public defender, tried his best to cross-examine the witnesses. But it was clear that he was struggling. He fumbled through his notes, asking hesitant questions that failed to undermine the prosecution's case. The jury barely paid attention when he spoke, their minds already made up by the slick, polished arguments of the prosecution. Liam felt a wave of hopelessness wash over him as he listened to his attorney stammer through his defense. How could he win when the entire town had already judged him guilty? He had no money to hire a better lawyer, no way to prove that he hadn't stolen the necklace. It was his word against that of Mr. Morrow, a man who was beloved by the community. As the trial dragged on, Liam's heart sank further. Every glance at the jury told him the same thing. They didn't believe him. His attorney barely had time to prepare a proper defense, let alone counter the well-prepared arguments of the prosecution. And as the hours passed, Liam's future began to look bleaker and bleaker. When it came time for his defense, his lawyer stood, his face weary. He spoke softly, addressing the jury with little conviction. "Ladies and gentlemen, my client, Liam, is a good boy. He has no prior record, no history of theft or dishonesty. He helps his mother, works hard, and tries to get by, just like many others in this town. Yes, he is poor, but that doesn't make him a thief." The attorney glanced at Liam, giving him a weak smile, but Liam couldn't muster one in return. The attorney continued, but his words lacked the force and passion needed to sway the jury. His cross-examinations had fallen flat, and he struggled to poke holes in the prosecution's story. It seemed like a losing battle. Liam's heart sank further as his lawyer gave his closing remarks. "This is a case of mistaken identity. Liam didn't steal anything. The prosecution has no direct evidence, no video footage, no eyewitness account of the theft itself. All they have are assumptions." But assumptions, Liam knew, were enough for the jury. They saw a poor boy from the wrong side of town, accused of stealing from one of the wealthiest, most respected men in the community. That was all they needed. As the trial neared its conclusion, Liam's fear gave way to a numbness. He felt like he was floating above the scene, watching as the people in the courtroom discussed his life as if it were just another case, another number on their docket. His fate rested in the hands of people who had already made up their minds. Yet despite the crushing weight of the situation, Liam knew there was one thing that none of them knew, one truth that could change everything. But revealing it would come at a great cost. He wasn't sure if he was ready to face the consequences of that truth, even if it could save him. The judge called a brief recess, and Liam was led back to a small waiting room to prepare for the final stretch of the trial. His lawyer sat beside him, flipping through papers, but Liam barely noticed. His mind was racing, his heart pounding in his chest. The revelation, his revelation, was something he had hoped to keep buried. But now, with everything on the line, he wondered if he could afford to stay silent any longer. The courtroom reconvened, and as Liam was led back to his seat, the weight of his decision pressed down on him like never before. Could he reveal the truth? Could he face the consequences of what he had kept hidden for so long? Or would he let the trial proceed as it was, with his innocence left to chance and the mercy of a jury that had already judged him? His fate was now in his own hands. The courtroom buzzed with tension as the judge called for the next witness to take the stand. All eyes shifted toward the large, intricately carved doors as they creaked open, revealing a poised woman in a tailored navy suit, walking with a steady, confident stride. Mrs. Roswell, one of the wealthiest and most influential women in town, was no stranger to these kinds of settings. With her air of authority and calm demeanor, she was the type of witness who could sway an entire jury without breaking a sweat. Liam watched her approach the stand, his stomach turning as her heels clicked against the polished floor. He had heard her name mentioned throughout the trial, but this was the first time he'd laid eyes on her since the day of the incident. Mrs. Roswell owned several properties in town and was known for her philanthropy, attending every charity gala and event the town held. She also had strong connections with Mr. Morrow, the jeweler who had accused Liam of the theft. It was no surprise she had come forward to testify against him. As she took her seat, smoothing the wrinkles from her skirt, her cold eyes briefly flickered toward Liam before she turned her attention back to the prosecutor. The brief glance sent a shiver down his spine. It was as if she was staring through him, as if he were nothing more than a nuisance in her otherwise perfect world. The prosecutor wasted no time, stepping forward with an air of confidence. "Mrs. Roswell," he began, "thank you for being here today. Can you please tell the court what you witnessed on the day the necklace was stolen from Mr. Morrow's store?" Mrs. Roswell nodded gracefully. "Of course," she said, her voice steady and polished. "I was running some errands near Mr. Morrow's shop when I noticed a young boy lingering outside. He seemed suspicious. I remember thinking that he didn't belong in that part of town." She gave a pointed look toward Liam, her implication clear. "He was near the window of the store, and I watched him for a few moments. Later, when I heard about the theft, I realized he must have been planning it all along." Liam clenched his fists in his lap, struggling to maintain his composure. He wanted to scream that she was lying, that he hadn't even been near the store that day, but he knew better than to disrupt the proceedings. Still, her words gnawed at him. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was something off about her testimony, something that didn't quite fit. As Mrs. Roswell continued, Liam's mind raced back to that day. He had been running errands for his mother, as he often did, but he hadn't gone near the jewelry store. He'd only passed it by once, on his way to pick up some bread, and then, like a flash of lightning, it hit him. He had seen Mrs. Roswell that day, but it hadn't been outside Mr. Morrow's shop. Suddenly, fragments of memory started to fall into place. Liam remembered seeing Mrs. Roswell in a very different part of town. She had been at the train station, arguing with a man near one of the platforms. He hadn't paid much attention at the time, but now the memory was vivid. The man she had been speaking to was younger, dressed in a shabby coat. Liam recalled overhearing part of their heated conversation before he hurried on his way. What had they been arguing about? And why was Mrs. Roswell hiding it? Back in the courtroom, Mrs. Roswell's testimony continued, but something in her demeanor began to change. Her confident posture stiffened ever so slightly, and her eyes began to dart nervously around the room. She seemed less composed now, as though she could sense that someone, perhaps Liam, had caught on to her inconsistencies. The prosecutor finished his questioning, and now it was time for Liam's defense attorney to cross-examine her. He stood slowly, his face weary, but something about his approach felt different this time. He seemed to have sensed the shift in Mrs. Roswell's demeanor too, and though he was not the most skilled attorney, even he knew that something was amiss. "Mrs. Roswell," the defense attorney began, adjusting his glasses and stepping forward, "you testified that you saw my client, Liam, loitering outside Mr. Morrow's store on the day of the alleged theft. Is that correct?" "Yes, that's correct," she replied, her voice a touch too sharp. "And you said you watched him for a few moments, believing him to be acting suspiciously?" "Yes," she said, her tone growing more clipped. The defense attorney nodded thoughtfully, then leaned on the edge of the witness stand, peering at her with curiosity. "Mrs. Roswell, may I ask what other errands you were running that day? Were you in the area for a specific reason?" There was a pause, a hesitation that did not go unnoticed by the jury. Mrs. Roswell blinked, her lips pressing together before she answered. "I was shopping, just as I usually do. Nothing out of the ordinary." "Shopping," the attorney echoed. "I see. And do you recall what time you were in the vicinity of Mr. Morrow's store?" Again, a pause. This time it was longer, and the nervousness in her eyes was becoming more apparent. "Around noon, I believe," she said, though her voice wavered ever so slightly. Liam's attorney straightened up, his expression thoughtful. "Interesting," he said quietly, before pacing back toward the jury. "Because I have reason to believe, Mrs. Roswell, that you were not near Mr. Morrow's store at noon that day. In fact, I believe you were at the train station, speaking with a man. Isn't that true?" A hush fell over the courtroom. Mrs. Roswell's eyes widened in shock, her composed facade beginning to crack. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. She glanced nervously at the prosecutor, as if silently pleading for help, but the prosecutor remained still, unsure of how to respond to this sudden turn. I don't recall," Mrs. Roswell stammered, her voice now a far cry from the confident tone she had used earlier. "You don't recall?" the defense attorney pressed. "Or are you trying to hide something? Perhaps there was more going on that day than you've let on. Who was the man you were arguing with at the train station?" Mrs. Roswell's face paled, and she shifted uncomfortably in her seat. The jury was now watching her intently, and the once confident witness seemed to be unraveling before their eyes. Liam's heart raced as he watched the scene unfold. Could it be that Mrs. Roswell was involved in something shady herself? Was she lying to cover her own tracks? Finally, Mrs. Roswell spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't see how that's relevant. I was at Mr. Morrow's store later that day. I saw the boy. But you didn't mention anything about the train station before, the attorney pointed out. Why is that? What were you doing there? I don't have to explain myself to you, she snapped, her composure slipping further. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. The jury leaned forward in their seats, clearly sensing that there was more to Mrs. Roswell's story than she was willing to admit. Liam watched her with wide eyes, his mind racing. Could she have been the one behind the theft? Could her testimony have been a ploy to shift suspicion away from herself? Whatever the truth was, it was clear that Mrs. Roswell was hiding something, and it was only a matter of time before the courtroom found out what it was. The courtroom was silent as the judge called Liam to the stand. The boy stood slowly, his legs trembling as he made his way to the front of the room. All eyes were on him, some filled with pity, others with disdain. Everyone expected this to be the final nail in his coffin. He was just a poor boy after all, without power, wealth, or connections. His case seemed hopeless. The prosecution had painted a damning picture, and the town had already convicted him in their minds. Liam's defense attorney looked weary, like a man resigned to defeat, but there was something different about Liam today. As he settled into the witness chair, he lifted his head, his eyes scanning the room with an intensity that hadn't been there before. The judge, a stern-looking man with a furrowed brow, peered over his glasses at Liam. "Do you understand that you are under oath, young man?" he asked, his voice echoing through the room. "Yes, Your Honor," Liam replied, his voice clear but steady. "Very well," the judge said. "You may proceed." The prosecutor rose from his seat, confident as ever, and approached the witness stand. He had been relentless in his questioning throughout the trial, confident that Liam would crumble under pressure, just as every other witness had. Today would be no different, or so he thought. "Liam," the prosecutor began, his voice dripping with condescension, "you've heard all the testimony against you. You were seen near Mr. Morrow's store, and Mrs. Roswell herself has testified that she saw you acting suspiciously that day. You have no alibi, no witnesses in your defense. Why don't you tell the court why you were there? Why did you steal the necklace?" A murmur ran through the courtroom. The question, blunt and accusatory, hung in the air like a dagger poised to strike. The spectators leaned in, eager to hear Liam's response. They expected a stammered denial, perhaps some futile explanation that would do little to save him from his inevitable fate. But what they got instead was something no one anticipated. Liam sat up straighter in his chair, his eyes locking with the prosecutor's. There was no fear in his gaze, no desperation, just a quiet resolve. "I didn't steal the necklace," Liam said calmly, his voice cutting through the tense atmosphere like a knife. "In fact, Mrs. Roswell gave it to me." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. The prosecutor blinked, momentarily caught off guard. He hadn't expected this. "Gave it to you?" the prosecutor repeated, clearly trying to maintain his composure. "Are you saying Mrs. Roswell, a respected member of this community, gave you a $1,000 necklace? For what possible reason?" Liam took a deep breath, his eyes never leaving the prosecutor's. "Earlier that day, Mrs. Roswell asked me to run an errand for her. She said she needed the necklace polished before a party that evening. She handed it to me and told me to take it to the jeweler across town. She promised to pay me once I brought it back." The courtroom was now abuzz with whispered conversations. The prosecutor's confident smirk faltered as he glanced toward Mrs. Roswell, who sat rigid in her seat, her face paling with each word Liam spoke. She shifted uncomfortably, her hands clutching the armrests of her chair. The prosecutor, clearly rattled, pressed on. "And why should we believe this story? You have no proof of any such arrangement. Isn't it more likely that you saw an opportunity and took it?" Liam shook his head. "Number. When I brought the necklace back to Mrs. Roswell after having it polished, she was waiting outside the store. But instead of paying me, she accused me of stealing it. I didn't understand why at first, but then I realized she was setting me up. The room erupted into a cacophony of murmurs and gasps. The prosecutor turned to Mrs. Roswell, his expression uncertain. Mrs. Roswell, who had been so composed throughout the trial, now looked like she had seen a ghost. Her once dignified demeanor had completely crumbled. Her hands trembled as she tried to maintain her composure, but the color had drained from her face. "Mrs. Roswell," the prosecutor called, his voice suddenly lacking its earlier confidence. "Do you have any response to this claim?" The room went silent as all eyes turned toward her. Mrs. Roswell sat frozen in her seat, her lips pressed tightly together. Her eyes darted around the room, seeking an escape, but there was none. The tension in the room was suffocating. Finally, Mrs. Roswell spoke, but her voice was faint, and the confident authority that had once carried her words was now gone. This is preposterous," she stammered. "Why would I had no reason to—" "Mrs. Roswell," the defense attorney interrupted, his voice calm but firm. "Why didn't you mention this errand in your testimony earlier? If what Liam is saying isn't true, why didn't you deny it before now?" Mrs. Roswell's eyes flickered nervously, her hands shaking as she fumbled for words. I didn't think it was important," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. "Not important?" the defense attorney pressed. "You didn't think it was important to mention that you had given the boy the necklace yourself? That you asked him to run an errand for you?" "I didn't," Mrs. Roswell began, but her words faltered, and the courtroom was now filled with the sound of whispers and murmurs from the gallery. The jury watched her closely, their expressions shifting from confusion to suspicion. The prosecutor stood frozen, unable to intervene. Liam seized the moment, his voice steady and clear. "I didn't steal that necklace. I was just trying to help. I've been doing odd jobs for people in town for months now, just trying to make enough to get by. Mrs. Roswell knew that. She took advantage of me." The courtroom exploded into chaos. Spectators murmured to one another, and even the judge seemed momentarily at a loss for words. Mrs. Roswell sat there, her once impeccable composure shattered, unable to meet the eyes of anyone in the room. Finally, the judge raised his hand, calling for order. He turned to Mrs. Roswell, his expression stern. "Mrs. Roswell," he said slowly, "I suggest you answer the defense's question. Did you, or did you not, give the boy the necklace?" For a long, agonizing moment, Mrs. Roswell said nothing. Her face had turned an ashen shade of white, and her hands trembled uncontrollably. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. I made a mistake," she confessed, her voice breaking. "I didn't mean for it to go this far. I just didn't want to get into trouble." The courtroom erupted in gasps, and the prosecution visibly recoiled. Mrs. Roswell buried her face in her hands, her once pristine reputation crumbling before everyone's eyes. Liam sat quietly, relief washing over him as the weight of the accusation lifted from his shoulders. He had told the truth, and the truth had finally come to light. The courtroom was still buzzing with the aftershocks of Mrs. Roswell's confession. The once proud and respected socialite now sat hunched in her chair, her face buried in her hands. The murmur of the crowd filled the room like the low rumble of a storm brewing on the horizon. Spectators who had once whispered rumors about Liam being a thief now exchanged looks of disbelief and guilt. The young boy they had been so quick to condemn had just revealed a truth so shocking that it left them grappling with their own judgment. As Mrs. Roswell's confession settled over the room, the air seemed to thicken with the weight of her deception. Judge Harrison, his usual stoic demeanor unshaken by the revelation, called for order once again, his gavel striking sharply against the wood. The chatter gradually died down as the courtroom returned to a tense silence. Mrs. Roswell sat motionless, and all eyes were now on the defense attorney, who, despite his earlier exhaustion, stood a little taller now, his confidence renewed. Liam's public defender had been worn down by the weight of an overwhelming case, but with the tide now turning, his voice carried a newfound strength. "Your Honor," he began, stepping toward the bench, "in light of Mrs. Roswell's confession and the truth that has finally come to light, I request an immediate dismissal of all charges against my client Liam." The judge nodded gravely, considering the words for a moment before speaking. "I believe we have heard more than enough evidence to render a verdict." The truth of this case has indeed come to light, and I commend the courage it took for young Liam to stand up and reveal it. His eyes softened as they landed on Liam, who sat at the witness stand, still processing the gravity of what had just happened. This boy has been through enough. With a wave of his hand, Judge Harrison motioned to the bailiff. Release the boy from custody immediately. A collective sigh of relief passed through the courtroom. Liam, still in a state of shock, felt his hands being freed from the restraints that had bound him throughout the trial. He rubbed his wrists absent-mindedly, the sensation of freedom still foreign to him after days of feeling the weight of his impending fate. He glanced around the courtroom. The faces that had once glared at him with suspicion now softened with a mix of pity and regret. But their apologies, though whispered and muttered under their breath, meant little to him now. The prosecutor, who had been so confident of an easy victory, was now visibly deflated. He slumped in his seat, rifling through his papers as though searching for something, anything that could salvage the case. But the facts were clear now, and there was nothing more he could do. Judge Harrison cleared his throat, drawing the attention of the room once more. As for Mrs. Roswell, he began, his voice cold and authoritative, you have committed a grave injustice, not only to this boy, but to the court and to the community. You framed an innocent child for your own personal gain, manipulating the legal system to shield yourself from scrutiny. Your actions are reprehensible, and you will face the full consequences of the law. Mrs. Roswell's once proud and composed exterior had crumbled entirely. She looked small and frail as she sat there, trembling and silent. The room seemed to close in around her as the bailiff approached to take her into custody. She didn't protest, didn't speak. Her earlier confidence evaporated like mist in the morning sun. The fall from grace had been swift and brutal, and the townspeople who had once respected her now looked upon her with disgust and betrayal. As the bailiff placed her in handcuffs, Mrs. Roswell's eyes darted around the room, searching for sympathy or an ally. But there was none. She had sealed her fate, and there was no undoing the damage she had caused. She would soon face charges of perjury, fraud, and obstruction of justice, crimes that would likely see her behind bars for a long time. The sound of the gavel striking wood once more brought the room back to attention. This court is adjourned, the judge declared, rising from his seat. The crowd began to disperse, the air thick with whispered conversations, each person reflecting on the events that had just unfolded. It was clear that the town would not soon forget what had transpired here. As the people filed out, Liam stood from his chair, his legs feeling weak beneath him. The public defender placed a hand on his shoulder, giving him a small, reassuring nod. You did well, Liam, he said softly. I know this was hard, but the truth came out in the end. Justice was served. Liam wanted to feel relief, but all he could muster was exhaustion. His ordeal had been long and painful, and though he had been proven innocent, the experience had left him scarred. He could still feel the sting of the town's judgment, the way they had looked at him with suspicion and contempt. Even though they now saw the truth, something inside him had shifted. He wasn't sure he could ever trust them again. Outside the courthouse, the sky had darkened, casting long shadows across the street. Liam walked slowly down the steps, his mind still racing. As he reached the bottom, he saw a group of townspeople standing together, whispering and exchanging guilty glances. One by one, they approached him, offering stammered apologies. We're sorry, Liam, one man said, his voice thick with regret. We didn't know. We didn't realize. Please forgive us, a woman added, her eyes brimming with tears. Liam looked at them, their faces filled with remorse, but he said nothing. He had spent days in a cell, labeled a thief, while they had gossiped and cast judgment without knowing the full story. Their apologies felt hollow now, and though he didn't harbor hatred, he couldn't find it in himself to forgive them just yet. He turned away, his thoughts heavy. He had been exonerated, but his innocence had come at a cost. The town's perception of him had shifted, but his perception of the town had changed too. He had learned a harsh truth, that people were quick to judge, quick to believe the worst, and slow to admit when they were wrong. As Liam walked home, he thought about what his future would hold. The ordeal had shaken him deeply, but it had also strengthened something inside him. He knew now that he couldn't rely on others to define his worth. He would have to rebuild his life on his own terms, stronger and wiser from the experience. Behind him, the courthouse doors slammed shut, and the town slowly returned to its daily routine. But for Liam, the events of the trial would never fully fade. He had been accused, betrayed, and judged by those he thought he knew. And though justice had been served, the scars of the experience would stay with him, shaping the person he would become. As he walked into the twilight, a sense of quiet resolve settled over him. Liam had been through the worst, but he had survived. And though his trust in others had been shaken, his belief in his own strength had never been clearer. He was free, but the journey to rebuild his life was just beginning. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more like it, don't forget to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe. Let me know in the comments what you thought about the story and share any themes or ideas you'd like to hear in future stories. Your feedback means the world to me. Thanks for watching.